Hello, this is Gareth from the iMoot team. Welcome. Great pleasure to introduce Tim Hunt, senior developer, a man who really is really famous, whose quizzes has worked at Moodle HQ for a year, who I've enjoyed using his code as well. Absolutely brilliant, and a man who always has a quiz up his sleeve. So over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Gareth. Not quite sure what to make of that introduction. So, and despite what Gareth has just said, what I'm about to talk about has very little to do with code. And actually, I really shouldn't be taking any credit for this at all, because almost everything I'm going to tell you about is things that have been learnt by Open University teachers about how students use online quizzes and so on. And, you know, this is stuff I've seen at internal seminars at the Open University where other people have presented it. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. And so I wanted to share it with the wider Moodle world. So that's what we're about. As I was preparing this, I thought there are actually alternate names we could give this presentation. We could just call it lots and lots of graphs, because that's what it's going to be. I hope you like graphs. Really what makes it interesting is the stories behind the graphs, and that's what I'm going to be telling you about. And if you wanted to sound pretentious, this sort of thing could be called the scholarship of learning and teaching. If you want to sound posh, that's a phrase to remember: scholarship and teaching and learning. But before I started, I didn't really know what my audience would be. I see a fair number of familiar names in the list, but how many of you already know a little bit about what the Open University is? No, not ignorant. Bob, ready to learn, I think is probably a better phrase. Okay, well, just briefly say, because we have got some overseas people, the Open University is a purely distance learning university. We were founded in the 1960s, so we're about 40, I can't remember how many, over 40 years old. We haven't yet got to the 50th birthday. And we are based a little bit north of London, sort of halfway between London and Birmingham, very close to Cranfield University. I heard an interesting talk by two people from Cranfield University yesterday. And we're based in the new town of Milton Keynes, which was also started in the 1960s. And as you can see, when they built Milton Keynes, the town planners did a very good job. You can see an awful lot of green space there surrounding the Open University campus, even though we're right in the heart of Milton Keynes. So I think I'm going to try and ignore the chat because it seems to, it's too amusing. Yes, so the Open University has always embraced the latest technology for education, back to using broadcast television in the 1970s when that's what was available. And we jumped on the internet fairly early. And in 2005, we jumped on Moodle, which means scarily that the autumn of this year, 6 months' time, we'll have been using Moodle for 10 years. The students first saw it in about this time of year, 2006. So all distance education. When I arrived, the only thing I remember from my induction is that we were told they sent out 20 tons of paper mail every year. These days it's much, much less because so much has moved online. And just the final zoom in, this is the building where I work. Actually, if you go up the path in the middle, that's the entrance to the main reception. And I'm up in what is called level 2. I'm actually, my desk is kind of behind that tree in this building. So that's a little bit about the Open University. This is what our Moodle site looks like, or one of them. I've lost count of how many Moodle sites we have. It's getting up towards a dozen. But this is the main one where, well, we call them modules, but they're what Moodle's called courses. This is where all the main courses are, where students learn. This is the course page. It's typical sort of Moodle study planner, Moodle course format, a bit like weeks format, but as you might be able to see at the Open University, a week is sometimes actually 2 weeks. This format has a nice feature. It kind of highlights the current week, and it shows you the current week with the surrounding weeks by default, so you can sort of see where you're meant to be. If you need to see the whole planner, you can get to that. So that's just one site. We get quite a lot of traffic. This I pulled out of one of our monitoring systems, just to kind of show you that things sort of start between 7 and 9 in the morning. They ramp up and they're pretty much busy all day. Some days you can kind of see the lunch break because everyone's studying at lunchtime and in their office, but doesn't really seem to be showing up on this day. And it kind of tails off from about 9 or 10 at night. So we do luckily get a quiet period overnight where a lot of the big slow batch jobs can run. And at the bottom you see our sort of typical page load times are pleasingly down under 1/3 of a second most of the time, except for a few slow ones. I shouldn't really be talking about this. Was my last year's talk at the iMoot about how the Open University hosts Moodle, but I stole another picture from it too. To make this run at this sort of scale, we have quite a lot of servers, but as I say, if you want to know about that, find my iMoot talk from last year, which is presumably somewhere on YouTube. So let's get more onto what we're supposed to be talking about, which is the quiz. It's a Moodle quiz with our particular theme, which is fairly close to the standard one. Here's a typical maths question, because I thought Joshua would probably be in the audience and would like to see one of our stat questions. Yep. I will just point out a couple of things where this quiz is using the interactive with multiple tries behavior. So you can, in the middle of the quiz attempt, you can get your answer to that question checked. Turns out I can remember how to do integration, so I got it right. And we've got quite a lot of feedback in there. So in this case, we've got a sort of worked solution, and if you don't understand the worked solution, it's got a pointer to the relevant bit of the study guide. And just to balance things out, here's an example picked from a languages course, a listening one, so we've got the media player there. So, and this is kind of what tells me that the job I do at the OU is actually quite worthwhile. This is the total number of quiz attempts made each year, going back to about when we adopted Moodle. So it's now about 600,000 a year. And of course, the current academic year isn't complete, which is why that bar is taller. The sad fact that the bars are getting just starting to get shorter last year is unfortunately due to politics. In 2012, they changed how higher education in the UK was funded, and this has been quite bad for part-time higher education. And it's a bit sad that it shows up in this graph of how much quizzes are used, because the number of different courses using quizzes is still going up. It's just the number of students is starting to come down. So we need better higher education funding, of course. But on to the real part of the talk, which is about how our students use quizzes. And as I talk about this, I'd really quite like to know who is in the audience. So if you could type one word, just like what your relation to Moodle is. Are you a teacher, a student, an admin, a developer? I'd be just interested to know kind of what sort of audience I'm addressing. I like fence sitter. Okay, well, that is the kind of audience this is aimed at, I would say. So this is promising. So the first graph I want to show is actually the one I've seen most recently. I only saw it about 6 weeks ago. So there are quite a lot of teachers in the room. So I guess we know as teachers that what gets assessed is quite important. Really must stop trying to follow the chat as well. So what I'm about to show is a graph from at the end of every course module, we survey the students to see what they thought about it. I guess many universities do the same thing. So what this is showing is just the answers to 3 of the questions on the survey. And they're the kind of questions that are, Likert scale, completely disagree to strongly agree. So the orange bar is, of course, the kind of main thing we want to know from students. Overall, I'm completely satisfied with the quality of the module. And what makes this graph interesting is how similarly the answer to the other 2 questions relates to that, which suggests that the things the other 2 questions ask about are very important to the student's overall experience of the module. So the blue bar is I had a clear understanding of what I had to do to complete the assessed work. So clearly that whether you get that bit right has a big effect on whether students like the module. And really interestingly, the green bar is the assessed activities helped me learn. So that's something we might believe as educators. I don't know why we're saying we, because I'm not a teacher myself, though I feel a strong affinity to people who are. So something we would talk about in sort of learning design is authentic assessment. Really assessing what we're trying to teach, and you might think that was important as a teacher, but would you have realised that students would know if you were getting that right? Well, this graph seems to show that students can tell if the assessment is, good and helps them learn what they're supposed to learn. And similarly, just unclear assessment clearly annoys people a lot. When you're assessing people, it's kind of stressful enough. You want it to be clear to them what they're supposed to be doing, so you're really assessing their knowledge and not their ability to follow unnecessarily complex procedures. So I thought that was a pretty interesting graph. But that's about opinions. I mean, this is what students think. It's worth finding that out, but sometimes people don't know what's best for them. So now I've got a couple of stories that try to get to the bottom of, do quizzes actually help students learn? And this one might be a bit scary because it's from a 3rd level physics course, so it's quantum mechanics. And although I'm going to talk about this one quantum mechanics course, there are actually 4 third-year physics courses at the OU. And you can the data from all 4 courses is very similar. So this one, although this story is about one particular module, it actually applies in the 4 modules at the end of the physics degree. So the story starts probably back in about 2007 or so. This stuff is hard. I mean, I did a maths degree once, and that included a quantum mechanics course. So about 20 years ago, I might actually have known how to answer this question, but I've certainly forgotten now. They had the problem that students would get to the exam and quite a lot of them would fail, or they just wouldn't turn up to the exam because they thought they would fail. And at the time, the course was being assessed in a way that was typical for a lot of Open University courses. There were 4 assignments during the course. And students would write the assignments either on paper or as a Word document, send it off to their tutor, and a week or 2 later they would get some feedback and discover if they'd got it right. And while that was quite helpful, I mean, only 4 opportunities to get feedback during the course wasn't really enough. So they were having this problem, as I say, with too many students getting to the exam and not being able to cope with it. So they needed to try something. And what they tried was to change the 4 written assignments to also include some Moodle quizzes. Actually, well, technically not Moodle, but let's ignore that detail. They were online quizzes, and for obscure reasons, online quizzes at the OU get called ICMAs, interactive computer marked assignments, as opposed to tutor marked assignments. So by the end, the module had 4 tutor marked assignments and 6 computer marked assignments, with the computer marked ones, the Moodle quizzes, set up with what we now call interactive behaviour, so that students could get immediate feedback, and if they got a question wrong, they would get some feedback and then they could try and fix their own mistake. To avoid overloading students, they didn't make everything compulsory. The rule was you had to choose 7 of the assessed activities and do at least those. So you could just do 4 tutor-marked ones and 3 computer-marked ones. You had to do at least 2 tutor-marked ones. So you had to be somewhere in the green area in terms of what you actually studied, what you handed in. And you could do more, so anywhere in the green area, and this is what students actually did. So what you're seeing there is the number of students in each box. And as you can see, this is still quite a hard module. There were too many students who started and didn't complete it, which is still a problem, but it's better than it was. Of course, what we really want to know is what effect did this have on their score in the exam? And that looks like this, which is quite good. As you can see, a lot of students who did very few activities didn't even do the exam, but it's what you'd want to see. Students who did all the assessed work got a better mark. I assume this is what we'd want to know as teachers, that what we're getting students to do helps them. So, is this enough to conclude that Moodle quizzes are wonderful and they help students? Well, unfortunately, no, it isn't, because there's an alternative hypothesis. Rather than it being doing the quizzes helps students, it could just be that for the cleverer students, doing the quizzes and the assessments is much easier. So it's the clever students that do all the work, more work, and so the clever students are going to get a better mark anyway. It wasn't doing the work that got them a good mark, it was just because they're good. So there's a question there about what the marks sort of mean. At the Open University, there are very few levels. There's sort of pass, merit, and distinction. So the pass mark is 40%, and a sort of distinction, a top grade, is normally 85%. Though that's sometimes adjusted on a difficult module like this. So you can see even down the bottom there, students who did two written assignments and 6 computer mark quizzes, on average, they were failing. Lack of control group is always a problem in education research, particularly education research using real teaching rather than sort of artificial experiments. Because if you are doing something to help students, then it's kind of, you worry about the ethics if you only make that extra help available to some of the students, not all of the students. But yes, we somehow need to control the numbers we're seeing here for how good the students were. And yep, Richard, there's very interesting stuff about the ethics of doing research to learn stuff that will help people in future, and I don't want to go into it now, but if you think that sounds interesting, read Ben Goldacre's books, if you haven't already. So anyway, we would like to control this for how good the students are, and luckily at the Open University, we have a sort of statistics team in our Institute of Educational Technology, and they have a fairly good model of the students, and it takes into account factors like the students' demographics and their previous education, and we'll get a sort of prediction of what we would expect their course result to be based on sort of general factors. And we can use that to control. And in particular, because these are third level students, they've already done several years of study with us. So we have a good record from previous courses of typically what sort of mark they would get. So we can probably expect that the sort of model estimated, guess of what sort of mark they would get is reasonable. So what we should do is look at these exam marks compared to the sort of estimated predicted grades for these students from the statistical model. And when we do that, we see this. Students who did a lot of the work do better than the statistical model predicted they would do in the exam. And students who don't do or do the bare minimum of work or even less work than was required do much worse on the exam than predicted. So that does seem to suggest that the Moodle quizzes are actually teaching them something. I mean, this may be little more than time on task, which is always strongly correlates with learning, but at least it does suggest that these online quizzes are a worthwhile use of that time as students study. So I think that's about as good as you can get without doing a proper sort of randomized controlled experiment, which, as I said, is tricky to get approval for. So I quite like that example. And as I say, there were four third level physics modules that all showed similar results to this. Now, if we look at a slightly shorter example from the other end of the spectrum, this was a level 1 module, so a sort of introductory module at the start of a degree, right at the other end, and a great title, Robotics and the Meaning of Life. And again, they had a problem, which was students were getting to the end of this introductory module and they just weren't handing in the final assignment. They'd done all the study, they'd done the mid-course quiz, and they got to the end and they just were too scared to in the final assignment. So what they did was they split up the final assignment. The final assignment actually had two parts. There were some short answer questions and then a sort of simple programming project that they had to write up. So they took the short answer questions and rather than doing them as part of the same Word document that got uploaded to the assignment handling system, they made those a Moodle quiz. This case, without any immediate feedback, it was just really a different way to answer the same questions. And then the project bit stayed as a project. So that's the change they made. What effect did it have? Well, this is before they made the change. So, and this is the number of students completing. So to start with, there's a very odd thing here. Students who did the module in winter seemed more likely to complete than students who did the module in summer, which is rather strange, but something we see on a lot of modules. Never heard a really convincing explanation for why that is. Obviously, you can have various obvious guesses. So, but they weren't happy with only 75% of students submitting the final assignment, so they made this change, and this is what happened. In their summer presentation, it was dramatic. It jumped sort of 13%, which they were quite pleased with. And then the following summer, it jumped slightly less dramatically, but it was still significantly up on what it was before. And of course, we would really, really like to know if that trend continued, because there'd been some big fluctuations in the past. Unfortunately, as I said, the government changed the funding rules in 2012, and as a casualty of that, this module was discontinued. So we don't really know, again, kind of irritating that we did this kind of experiment and this is all the data we have and we would like more, but we don't have it. But again, a sign that just switching short answer questions to a Moodle quiz somehow makes them more attractive to answer. This next one's a really interesting story, and it's back to the level 3 physics course. And as I said, when they introduced these Moodle quizzes, the goal was really to get as many students as possible to do the quizzes to get the benefit of learning from them, doing the work, getting the feedback. So initially they said, right, we'll have a recommended date on which you submit the quiz. That's 0 here. But actually we'll leave the quiz open all the time. So if students are too busy before the deadline, they can do it a bit later. And so you can see by the deadline, 40% of students had done it. By a couple of weeks later, 65% had done it. And then you can sort of see there's a burst before the exam of people are catching up just before the exam. And you get up to 80%, which was quite good, but they wanted more. So what they tried was they changed this soft deadline into a hard deadline. And would anyone, particularly anyone who wasn't at my talk in the Dublin Moodle Moot, like to predict what happened when you change this to a strict deadline? Okay, well, that's what happened. More people did it when the deadline was strict than if it was available all the time. Yeah, it's pretty much my reaction. So, yeah, it's kind of actually use it or lose it is better for getting people to complete. Again, this is just one module. It did apply to all the tests in the module. But it's kind of interesting. I actually think, sorry, a bit of an aside, but in Moodle forums, it can track which posts you've read, and it does that automatically when you go and read them, and there's no way to go back. I think that's... So kind of when you go into a thread, you can't just sort of mark it as unread and come back later. You either read it then or you're never going to see it again. So I wonder if that's similar. Anyway, that one's, I thought, also quite interesting. That one's a bit surprising. The next one's really not surprising, I would say. What this graph shows, this shows an optional quiz. Well, it's a module with 4 optional quizzes, and you can see the quizzes all have 8 questions. And in this quiz, students are allowed to make multiple attempts. The dark blue at the bottom is the number of different students who made at least one quiz attempt, at least one attempt at that question. And then the bit sticking up to the top is what happens when you also count students who attempted the question more than once. 600 and something people attempted the first question, and in total there were sort of 1,700 and something attempts at that one question. So as you can see, as you go through the course, people do the quizzes less. And this might well be a module where we've done surveys and the students, say nice things about the quizzes, like how much they enjoy them and it helps them learn. Even so, they're clearly kind of voting with their feet, and they run out of time or something towards the end, or although they kind of think it would be helpful to do this optional quiz, they don't actually do it. Let's have another guessing game. What do you think happens on a course with 4 similar quizzes, but where there are marks available? Yeah, that's pretty much the case. And this is interesting because although the quiz has marks available, again, we allow repeated attempts. So there's still a bit of a drop-off, which I think is the kind of just students withdrawing from the course, which always happens in distance education, but the drop-off is much less. Now, the total attempts are not really down. This is a different module which will have a smaller student population. So you really need to just look at how it drops off compared to the first bar, really. And again, there's probably a bit of a drop-off in how many students are doing repeat attempts beyond the ones they need to, but it's still obviously, marks are the currency we have in educational courses to reward people, and yeah, if you pay them in marks, they will do it. It's a bit depressing, really, because it's extrinsic motivation, and you might hope they were kind of intrinsically motivated to learn all the interesting stuff we want to teach them, but such is life. That's that one. So I've said several times that at the Open University, we like the interactive with multiple tries behaviour, as Moodle calls it. And I'd be forgetting to give appropriate credit to the people who've done these various bits of research. Sorry, I might go back and do that at the end. These graphs take a while to get the feel for, so let me talk you through them. What's going on here? This is a question with 3 tries. Apologies that the access label is attempt. There's actually 3 tries at the same question, and the graph on the left is what we would like to see. What you see here is that on the first try at this question, more than half of the people got it right, and the rest of them put in an answer and got it wrong. And of the people who got it wrong, we give them some feedback. They click try again. And on the second try, again, half the people who got it wrong the first time get it right the second time. And of the rest, although they get it wrong again, they at least, they think about it, they try and put in a different answer. So it suggests they've actually paid some attention to the feedback and tried to fix their mistake. And then on the third attempt, a few more people, where we give them a bit more feedback, a few more people get it right, and most of the rest try a third different answer but still get it wrong. So that's what you'd kind of like to see if you do this sort of analysis of one of these interactive questions. The example on the right is what you don't want to see. What you see here is, well, I mean, fewer people got it right first, so it probably means it's a harder question. There's a big grey bit at the bottom. This is people who didn't bother to type in a sensible answer. They just put in rubbish and click the button to get some feedback without doing any work. So the big grey bit at the bottom is a worry. We don't want that because it suggests that students are trying to get the feedback without solving the problem on their own. And the other worry is you've got these big repeated bits. This big chunk of red in the second try is students who didn't change the answer they put in the first time. They just kind of submitting the second answer again to get submitting the same first answer again to get a bit more feedback without doing any more work. So again, students may tell you that the feedback is helpful, but here we have students who are getting the feedback but not using it to try and work out the answer to the question on their own. So they're not learning the way that we're hoping they are. So this research was done by someone called Sally Jordan, who I mention quite a lot because she's done a lot of this sort of stuff and it's interesting. Yes, Anne. Some people are just not bothering. They're clicking. They're putting in rubbish, clicking check 3 times, and because they know at the end they'll get a worked solution that tells them how to attack this problem. What we hope is that they only get the worked solution after they've tried to solve it themselves. It might be nice if Moodle could generate this sort of graph automatically, but it doesn't. You have to download the data into a spreadsheet and analyze it yourself. You can try and ask why this happens, and there are 2 real explanations. One is it's kind of just students being lazy, but it seems in a lot of cases what's actually going on is you've asked a question that is just incomprehensible to the students. It doesn't match what you've taught them. So really it's, in a lot of cases, it's just that you haven't actually taught them how to answer this sort of question, so they're looking at it without a clue, and they just want a clue. In some cases, you can see that they've then gone back and reattempted the whole quiz and done better the second time round. Of course, in other cases, you don't. Sorry, Joshua, I don't think we've automated this analysis. This is kind of manual work. By people who care enough to dig into the data. So the 2 here are very different, and that's because they're very different questions. The one on the left is a question that's working the way we want. It's well within students' abilities. So by the end, almost all the students have got it right after a few hints. The one on the right, even with a few hints, less than half the students got it right in the end. So, maybe it was too hard. What's more interesting, this next comparison is that it's much more similar, but there is a bit of a difference. You can see on the left, we've got slightly more bad behaviour, slightly more repeated answers than on the right. And what makes this interesting is that it's exactly the same question in exactly the same quiz. The quiz was reused. The one on the right is where the quiz is used in a course that it was originally designed for, Maths for Sciences. And quite happy with how it working. When it got reused in another module where it was just a small part of what students were learning, the same question in the same quiz performed less well. So I think that what that says is that when you're designing quizzes, there's no such thing as a good quiz. It's really, does this quiz fit into this course? Does it do what students need in this course? So that's a sort of interesting thing. And that, we've seen a lot of graphs, and they all throw up interesting questions and kind of what happens once you've looked at the data and found out the interesting questions. Then you need to kind of go and look in more detail at the particular quiz, what questions being asked, what answers students giving. Therefore, can we work out what's really going on that leads to this data? But the data kind of shows you where it's worth going and looking in more detail. So the final story I want to talk about is really something completely different, because it's less about the data and it's more about a particular question type. And this started back in, when did it start? Sort of 2005, 2006. It was a long time ago. Trying to wanting to know, can we get computers to automatically grade sentence length answers? And, a bit of a spoiler, but yes, we can, because here is a Moodle question that does that. Why does oil float on water? Well, for this screen grab, I put in an answer that is almost but not quite correct. I've said the oil floats on water because it's less dense, and it's not clear if I mean because the water is less dense or the oil is less dense. And the computer has not only spotted my answer is insufficient, it's given me some fairly specific feedback about why my answer isn't quite good enough yet. So, of course, that's an example I've set up. You don't have to believe me. So, the first interesting thing this research found is when you say, can computers do this, what's your kind of baseline? So the first thing they did in the research was get a bunch of these short answer questions and get a bunch of answers that students had given in various places, like in written assignments. And they got 6 different human OU tutors to grade all the answers using the mark scheme. And they compared how consistent the human markers grading was with the person who created the questions. Yeah, so this is kind of science, like 90%. They're clear factual questions. So it's quite surprising how inconsistent different human markers are. And when you dig into the numbers, what you find out what's going on is there are lots of answers that are clearly right, and lots of answers that are clearly wrong. Most people agree on those. And then you get to ones like the answer I gave for this oil on water question, where it's clear I've kind of got the right idea, but I haven't actually said it's the oil floats because the oil is less dense than water, or something along those lines. So it's the ones in the middle that are kind of, well, the students clearly have the right idea, but does it deserve the mark, is where a lot of the difference happens. So it sort of suggests that maybe 90% is the kind of, I mean, the other thing that happens with humans, of course, is if you're going through, what, I don't know, 250 different answer sentences and having to grade them, you're going to, your mind's going to switch off a bit. I mean, you're not going to be as awake on number 246 as you were on answer number 1. So there's a consistency issue. Computers will at least be completely consistent in following whatever rules you give them. So, yeah, quite surprising inconsistency between different humans. Sort of 90 to 95% is probably as good as the agreement you'll get between two humans. So when it comes to can computers grade this, 95% ought to be the kind of level you're aiming at. One other slightly interesting thing to point out is that the technology struggled most with this last question, question G, and it's also the one where the humans struggled to mark consistently. And really the root cause of that was that the question was worded in a slightly ambiguous way. It was about interpreting a graph. And if you read the question wrong, you would think they were asking for you to pick out a different thing on the graph than what they were actually asking about. So it also shows that irrespective of whether a human or a computer is going to grade this, wording the questions clearly is important. So initially they did this research, getting the computer using some very fancy sort of computational linguistics stuff. It would do a sort of grammatical parse of what the student had typed and try and find the verb and the nouns and so on. And it was very clever and it worked and we were quite pleased. But then they thought they'd try two other things because this was very clever. It was commercial software and we had to pay for it. Knocking around the OU, from at least the 1970s, we had this sort of matching system called pattern match, and that kind of looks for keywords, and it can look for keywords near other keywords or this word before that word, that sort of thing. And also another way you can match text is something called regular expressions that computer programmers like. So they tried, having sort of shown in principle that this was possible, and then had a sort of match off between these three technologies, and this research was done a bit later. You can actually see that all the matching percentages are a bit higher than on the last slide. And the interesting thing was that our sort of crude, simple pattern matching thing was pretty much as good as the expensive computational linguistics. And the other interesting thing, which the numbers don't show, is that this work was done by a sort of graduate student as a summer job. They felt that the pattern match was actually easier to understand. The computational linguistics, if it got confused, like I don't know, there are words in English that can be both a noun and a verb. If it picked a word in a sentence and decided this was the verb when actually it was a noun, it would get terribly confused. And yeah, okay, good example. I should have been able to think of that one. Thanks, Melanie. Whereas with pattern match, because it was much more simple-minded, you could at least understand what was going on. So even if it got things wrong, you could sort of see why and fix them. And also, the graduate student doing this felt that creating the regular expressions for this sort of thing, as Nadav kind of and Anne had sort of suggested, it's quite hard to use regular expressions for this kind of natural language matching, whereas the pattern match was much easier to write. So the net result of that is we made pattern match into a Moodle question type, and you can go and install it from the Moodle plugins database today, if you like. So that was the kind of range of stories I wanted to tell you. The first graph, sort of the student satisfaction numbers, shows that students care whether you get the assessment right. And they will note it. They can tell if the assessed activities are actually helping them learn what they think they should be learning, or if they just think it's kind of an irrelevant having to jump through hoops. I showed some data that tried to back up the claim that quizzes are actually a useful learning tool. They're a good thing to get students to do if your subject is one where what students need to practice. I mean, something like the quantum mechanics course, what a theoretical physicist needs to do is to be able to sit down and calculate those sorts of numbers, and the computer can assess whether they've calculated the right answer. So, a multiple choice quiz is often not very authentic, but some of these physics and science quizzes can be really quite authentic in terms of what we're trying to teach. And they seem to help students. We saw a bit that just digging into the data you get out of an online quiz can tell you quite a lot about how your students are doing in your course. It takes time to do that digging, but it can often be worth it. And just at the end, well, early on we saw an example stat question that shows that computers can grade quite complicated algebra. At the end, we saw they could grade simple human sentences. So you can do much more than multiple choice if you have time to set it up, and I think that's worth remembering. So that is pretty much everything I wanted to tell you. Thank you for listening, and I'll happily take questions now. That's right. Talking to people who've created pattern match questions, the sort of most common way that you will fail to grade a student's response the way you want is because the students thought of a different word than you have for what, so in the oil on water example, you might be thinking of density, but the students might say specific gravity, or I don't know, I'm currently failing to think of any other. So whenever you're doing sort of more ambitious online quizzes, the sort of thing I've heard several different people say, basically after the first time students have done the quiz, you will need to go back and look at the answers they actually gave and how they were graded, and you may need to correct things then, which you can do in Moodle. You can edit the grading rules and then regrade the quiz, and it will update the grades before you show the students the results. But after a couple of years, or after using the same quiz a few times with students, you'll get to the point where you've pretty much seen all the different ways they can write the answers you're looking for. Melanie, heavier is another one that you need to be careful with, because it's not really about mass, it is very much about density. If you had lots of oil and a little bit of water, all the oil would be heavier than the little bit of water. That's actually another interesting thing. Obviously students are a bit skeptical about whether the computer can really grade them automatically. And that's one of the reasons you need to give quite specific feedback. If you're going to tell them they're wrong, it's quite helpful to show that there's a particular reason about their answer that's why they're wrong. It's not just that the computer is stupid, or, because computers are stupid. So again, if they'd use the word heavier, you probably want to pick out the word heavier and say, well, that you're on the right lines, but of course it's not really heaviness, it's something else. Would you like to reword your answer? Nick, that's a very good question, and I don't know of any research on those lines. It's something I worry about with essay grading, which is a completely different technology. At the moment, there's a lot of research that sort of shows computers can grade essays about, with good correlation with what a human would grade them. But these are all essays that students wrote expecting them to be graded by a human. My guess is that if you know a computer essay algorithm is going to grade your work, you can learn some tricks to get a higher mark that aren't to do with what you know. But I don't think that applies to pattern match because they're such short, factual answers. Maureen raised the question of spelling, and what I didn't say, we've actually got a spell checker built in because basically we're not interested in checking the student's spelling in most cases. We want the sort of concept to test the conceptual knowledge, and it's much easier, if we can. So you have a spell checker to make sure all the words are individually spelt right before the computer tries to grade it, and that makes it easier for the computer. Okay, the pattern match question type and the drag and drop ones should work on all database types. There's no reason why they wouldn't. And if they don't work on your servers, please let me know, because that's a bug we'd want to fix. But there's really nothing very complicated in there. They should work. I mean, there is complicated PHP code, but it doesn't affect the database. There is actually one more thing I could show you if you've got a bit of time, and only really because I want to test my screen sharing. Shall I do that? Now, what does the screen share button look like?
Hi Tim, you should find it on the top left next to the earphones.
Green.
There. Yeah, we've got a few more minutes left, so there's time.
Should I be seeing a preview? What I'm failing.
It takes a little minute to kick in.
Oh, allow it to run Java, yes. Allow and remember. Okay. This is really me being cheeky. I wanted to test this for my other presentation on Sunday. But it is some interesting. So what I'm going to show you, if the technology works, drat, it's sharing this. I've got two monitors and it's sharing the wrong one. Let me try and tell it stop that and get it to share a window region. That's what we can do now. Good. Can I? That's kind of irritating. I can only share things on the same monitor as Big Blue Button, but if I just move this up. So in association with the Dublin Moodle Moot, where I was, when was it, a week or so ago, we did a survey of people asking them how they use the quiz. Okay. So in this survey, I just want to show you two of the answers. One of the questions was, do you think doing online quizzes saves you time? And 60% thought it did, and sort of 15% thought it didn't. And so that must leave about 15% of people who didn't express an opinion. That's interesting, because I know creating a Moodle quiz with good questions does take a lot of time, but clearly saving on the marking also saves a lot of time. The other one, which I was really pleased to see, and I have to say I'm pretty sure the people who completed this survey were a self-selected sample of people who use the Moodle quiz and like it, but do you think that Moodle quizzes help your students learn? Yes, 85%, no, 5%, so 10% people unsure. I was amazed how one-sided that was in the direction we'd like to see. So I've now got all this data, and I did a quick presentation of it at the Moodle conference, but now I really must find time to sort of write it up properly as a blog post. because some of the reasons why, we asked people why they thought it helped their students learn, and there's some really interesting stuff in there. So I need to publish it in some form, as I say, probably on my blog. So are there any other questions? Yes, Melanie, that's a whole area that I could have included in the talk, but I had to limit it. Over the years, we've asked students what they think about online quizzes in many surveys, and often they really value the feedback. As I say, sometimes they say they really value the feedback. Then you look at whether they're actually using the feedback to change their answer in those graphs, and you see they're not, which is a bit depressing, but still, most students do really value the feedback. So go on encouraging your instructors to write it. So I will just quickly, let me stop screen sharing. Let me quickly go back through the presentation and give appropriate credits. I did link to them on the iMoot site. In the course for this presentation, I did give links to the people who deserve the credit. The work on the level 3 physics was all someone called John Bolton, who sadly hasn't published much of this yet, but we're trying to get him to write it up in a journal at some point. And the level 1 robotics is another researcher called John Rosewell. Deadline stuff is John Bolton again, and a lot of the rest of the analysis about quizzes is Sally Jordan, and she has a blog which I've linked to, which is really interesting if you follow this sort of thing. Actually, the reason I'm not going to be around at iMoot tomorrow is that I'm going to see Sally Jordan graduate. She's getting her PhD, studied with the OU tomorrow. Pattern Match was mainly Sally and my colleague Phil Butcher. And the sad thing in my life is Phil has been guiding the development of the Moodle quiz at the OU for the last 10 years, and he retired at Easter, so I've got new people to work with. But they're the people who deserve credit there. Right, well, thank you all for your attention. I'll hang around a bit longer if there are any more questions, but I think that's basically it.
Hi, it's Gareth from the iMoot team. Thank you very much indeed, Tim, for your wonderful presentation. So much to take in, and for your time and what is really apparent the amount of effort that's gone into making it and providing it. So thank you very much indeed. I think there are no more questions, so I'll stop recording at this point, but allow people to ask a few more social wars in the chat. Thank you.